The Great War was a devastating, bloody conflict that encompassed the entire world. Nothing really more illustrates the global nature of the war than the large impact it had on Australia, which was virtually on the other side of the globe from the fighting on the Western Front. Having just become a country only 13 years before the outset of war, and with a population of under 5 million people, the First World War powerfully affected the largest nation in Oceania. But if the war affected Australia, Australia also powerfully affected the war, and not the least through the leadership of the man that the noted historian A.J.P. Taylor described as the only general of creative originality produced by the First World War. General John Monash and the Australian Corps changed not just the course of the war, but the nature of warfare itself. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Initially, there was a great deal of enthusiasm in Australia when the war started on August 4th, 1914, with Prime Minister Joseph Cook declaring, "When the Empire is at war, so also is Australia." The first Allied shot of the war was fired in Victoria by the Royal Australian Garrison Artillery at the German cargo ship SS Flaz, which surrendered and was later used as a troopship by the Australian Army. Australian troops saw service very early in the war, when the Volunteer Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force shipped out on August 19th to capture German wireless stations in the Southwest Pacific. The AN and MEF fought a number of battles to capture German New Guinea, which Australian troops occupied for the rest of the war, denying the territory as a base of support for the German East Asia Cruiser Squadron. Meanwhile, Australia was raising an army for foreign service in the war, with the first 20,000 men of the 1st Australian Imperial Force, or the 1st AIF, under the command of Brigadier General William Throsby Bridges, shipping out in November. It was a considerable feat to raise and equip an infantry division and light horse brigade so quickly. While Australia used mandatory national service for home defense, the Defence Act of 1903 did not allow conscripts to be sent overseas. The armed forces were largely designed around part-time militia service, with only a small number of regular personnel, mostly engineers and coastal artillery. The AIF had to be created as an all-volunteer force, and also had to be raised independently of the AN and MEF and their mission in the South Pacific. Despite stringent enlistment requirements, by December 1914, more than 53,000 men had been enlisted, and a second contingent reinforced the AIF in December. Eventually, the AIF would include over 330,000 men, an astounding number provided by a nation with a population of less than 5 million. While many of the officers had seen professional military service, the first AIF initially suffered from a lack of training and equipment shortages. While many of the men had received some basic training for their mandatory service, they were neither trained nor experienced in combat. The Australian force also initially lacked logistics and support units, being comprised mostly of infantry and light horse. Initially, the AIF equipment did not include hand or rifle grenades, and only included a small number of machine guns. Originally, the Australians were to be sent to England for further training before being sent to the Western Front. However, they were diverted to British Egypt instead, a decision largely driven by ease of transport, but also in light of the difficulty that the UK was already having housing and supplying Canadian troops in Britain. In Egypt, they could not only undergo further training, but could work to deter an attack by Turkey on the ever-important Suez Canal. The decision had a massive effect on Australian participation in the war, in that their presence in Egypt allowed the Allies to utilize the force in an effort to open a second front against the Central Powers, an attempt to knock Turkey out of the war. They would be sent to the ill-fated Gallipoli campaign. While Bridges still had overall command of the AIF, the Australians were combined with 2 brigades of the 1st New Zealand Expeditionary Force to form the Australia-New Zealand Army Corps. The Corps, consisting of the 1st Australia Division, the Australia-New Zealand Division, and various Indian and British units, was under the command of British General William Birdwood. Most of the Corps landed on the Aegean side of the Dardanelles on April 25, 1915. The Allies decided upon a night landing to provide cover and surprise. However, there was significant confusion in the darkness, and forces were largely landed over a mile from the beach that they were supposed to land, a place the Allies called Anzac Cove. In the confused battle, units ended up being thrown in piecemeal, and the beachhead was so tenuous that the division commanders recommended evacuation, only to be told by the Navy that it was not possible. The Corps took some 2,000 casualties in the landings to gain a precarious bridgehead of only about 2 miles. The landing could have been more of a disaster, but as the Turks had also taken around 2,000 casualties, they were not in a position to effectively counterattack. The Australia and New Zealand Army Corps proved tough in the fight, and the news of the landing initially spurred a wave of recruitment in Australia. But the Gallipoli campaign was a failure. In 8 months of bloody fighting, with attacks and counterattacks, the Turks failed to dislodge the bridgehead, but the Anzac failed to break out. Anzac abandoned their bridgehead in December without achieving their objectives. Despite committing nearly 500,000 British, French, Indian, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand troops, the Allies were unable to achieve their objectives and abandoned the campaign, having taken over 300,000 casualties. The AIF suffered more than 26,000 casualties, with more than 8,000 of those killed. Among the casualties was General Bridges, who was shot through the leg by a sniper in May and died of an infection. The AIF was evacuated back to Egypt, where more recruiting allowed it to be expanded, adding 3 more infantry divisions and establishing a mounted division. The mounted division remained in the Middle East, where they played a significant role in the Palestine campaign, but the rest of the AIF was headed to France and the bloody stalemate on the Western Front. 5 divisions was too large and unwieldy to be a single corps, and so in February 1916 the AIF was reorganized and once again combined with the New Zealanders and the British 25th Division to form the 1st and 2nd Anzac Corps. The 1st Anzac Corps remained under the command of Birdwood, and the 2nd Anzac Corps was under the command of General Alexander Godley, who had commanded the Australian-New Zealand Division at Gallipoli. Thus, the Australian troops were not under a single command, and neither corps was commanded by an Australian. The 5 divisions saw significant combat in France and Belgium, fighting in most of the major battles. They gained a reputation as formidable fighters, but also of displaying poor discipline and insubordination, especially on leave, perhaps a reminder of their nation's frontier founding. But while they were in Europe, the situation slowly changed back home. While the fighting at Gallipoli had spurred greater recruitment, the public had slowly soured on the fighting, and recruiting for the first time was insufficient to replace losses. Australians were shocked at the number of casualties, and for every soldier killed, another 2 came home, often with debilitating injuries. During June and July 1916, the AIF took 23,000 casualties in just 45 days fighting in the Battle of the Somme. Prime Minister Billy Hughes visited the front, and Birdwood and Godley convinced him that Australia needed to, like England, start conscripting troops rather than depending upon volunteers. It was a politically difficult position, opposed by much of Hughes' own Labour Party. Against their advice, he called a plebiscite to extend the existing conscription to the home defense to be extended to overseas service. The vote was held October 28th and rejected by a narrow margin. The divisive vote tore the Labour Party apart, and Hughes formed a new coalition to stay in power. Casualties continued to mount in the spring, and the AIF could not make good its mounting losses. After taking 7,500 casualties in the Battle of Bullecourt, plans to constitute a 6th division were scrapped. By November, the AIF was so depleted that there was talk of disbanding the 4th Division. Instead, the AIF was again reorganized and, for the first time, placed into a single corps, the Australian Corps, under Birdwood's command. It was the largest Allied corps on the Western Front. The New Zealand Division became part of the newly formed British 22nd Corps. In December 1917, a second referendum on conscription failed in a campaign so bitter that it was marked by a minor scandal when 2 young Australians threw an egg at Hughes, helping to prompt the creation of the Commonwealth Police. Hughes was disgusted at the loss and resigned, but with no credible replacement, he was quickly recommissioned. In the spring of 1918, the Germans, buoyed by the capitulation of Bolshevik Russia and prodded by the prospect of an additional 1,000,000 American troops into the Allied armies, pressed a spring offensive. The offensive was remarkably successful at first, and the German army pushed within 50 miles of Paris, on the verge of a stunning victory. The 5 Australian divisions were instrumental in stemming the tide. The offensive represented a turning point for the Corps. As a result of the early losses, General Sir Hubert Gough, commander of the British Fifth Army, was relieved. Birdwood was chosen to replace him, making an opening for the leadership of the Australian Corps. In May, for the first time, an Australian was chosen to command the Australian troops, General John Monash. Monash was an engineer who had been a colonel in the reserve at the outset of the war. Despite both parents being Prussian-born Jewish immigrants, a fact that created suspicion among some throughout his career, when the AIF was formed, he was given command of the 4th Infantry Brigade, which he had commanded at Gallipoli. In July 1916, he had been promoted to command of the 3rd Australian Division. He was known for close attention to detail and impressed the British High Command with his ability. Moreover, he had come to understand what only a few commanders had come to realize during the Great War. Success depended upon a careful coordination of military arms, not just infantry, but artillery, air power, and the new behemoths of the battlefield, tanks. He argued that the job of infantry was not to heroically throw themselves against machine guns, but to advance under the maximum possible protection of the maximum possible array of mechanical resources in the form of guns, machine guns, tanks, mortars, and aeroplanes, to advance with as little impediment as possible to hold territory. While the idea of combined arms was not new, and the use of tanks as part of combined arms had been pioneered in the Battle of Cambrai in November of 1917, Monash displayed a greater degree of understanding of the importance of coordinated use of all the combined elements of modern warfare. And the first test of his ability came on July 4th, 1918, at the Battle of Hamel. The battle, an operation to take a strategically useful point of high ground, was not a large engagement in the greater scheme of the vast First World War. The battle was interesting in that a few companies of American troops were included in an attempt to provide the American Expeditionary Force with some combat experience, a development that was notable given that the battle took place on the American Independence Day. But it was the results of Monash's careful planning and coordination of arms that were most important, as they were nothing short of astounding. Monash carefully combined all the power of modern arms, carefully deploying artillery, tanks, spotter and bomber aircraft. He deployed a method of supply that the Australians had pioneered, dropping medical supplies and food from aircraft using parachutes. Tanks moved up under the cover of the noise of harassing artillery, which then proceeded into a creeping barrage. The attack was so well planned that Monash was able to supply troops with a hot meal during the attack. The Battle of Hamel was a stellar demonstration of combined arms tactics for attacking an entrenched position. Monash had planned for the attack to last 90 minutes to take all its objectives. That turned out to be optimistic. It took 93 minutes. German counterattacks were ineffective, again due to Monash's planning, using artillery and air power to disrupt their lines of supply and communication. 2 Australians were awarded Victoria Crosses, and 1 American was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions during the battle. The following month, on August 8th, Monash's Australian Corps spearheaded the attack at the Battle of Amiens, utilizing the tactics tested at Hamel. It was a significant victory and a turning point in the war. The first decisive win for the British on the Western Front, and a crushing blow to the Germans. 50,000 German troops surrendered. German commander Erich Ludendorff described the defeat as the Black Day of the German army in the history of the war. It was the start of the 100 Days Offensive, the offensive that would end the war. John Monash was knighted shortly after the Battle of Amiens. Referring to his victories at Hamel and Amiens, Bernard Montgomery, who would become a field marshal in the next war, described John Monash as the best World War I general on the Western Front. The Australian Corps would continue to distinguish themselves through the 100 Days campaign, all the way through the end of the war. While his victories must be seen in the broader context of the war in 1918, where the German army had exhausted itself in the spring offensive, the infusion of troops from America significantly bolstered the Allies, and commanders had all gained significant experience, Monash achieved what others did not, and his tactics, more than any other, provided the tools that broke the stalemate of trench warfare. During the Great War, over 421,000 Australians served in the military, with more than 330,000 of those serving overseas. Over 60,000 of them lost their lives, and another 137,000 were wounded. That represents a casualty rate of almost 65% of the forces committed, among the highest of the war's combatants. Monash served in several civil roles after the war and was instrumental in the establishment of Anzac Day, a national day of remembrance to commemorate all Australians and New Zealanders who served and died in all wars, conflicts, and peacekeeping operations. Anzac Day is celebrated on April 25th, the anniversary of the landing at Anzac Cove during the Gallipoli campaign. John Monash is perhaps the most famous military commander in Australian history. Today in Australia, streets, roads, towns, an administrative district, a major highway, and a large research university all bear his name in Australia. He died of a heart attack in October 1931 at the age of 66. An estimated 300,000 people attended the funeral procession. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.